Professor Marlene Wind, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me begin with the broad picture. To what extent should the current Danish election be understood not merely as a domestic contest over welfare, inflation, and leadership fatigue, but as a referendum on sovereignty, geopolitical anxiety, and Denmark's place in an increasingly post-Atlantic Europe?
Well, thank you very much for having me here. I'll try to answer as good as I can. I think that there was some anticipation that this election would be a lot about geopolitics and also about Denmark's place in Europe. But it actually turned out to be merely like a background condition for everything else. It's not been dominating that much, even though there has of course been questions about who can we trust to run the government in times of crisis, and this kind of very, very broad take on the situation. It's not been really in any way a detailed discussion about what kind of Europe should we then have if we cannot trust the US anymore after Greenland and so on. It's been in the background. I also think it has to do though with the fact that the journalists who are covering national referendums are very, very narrow-minded in terms of what should be should be debated and asked about in a national election, and that has mainly been about healthcare and immigrants and so on. So it's certainly behind the international situation and geopolitics, but it's not been like moving all other debates aside.
Right. In your work, you have explored the tension between national constitutional traditions and European integration. How do you interpret Mette Frederiksen's transformation from one of Denmark's most sovereignty-conscious and Eurosceptic leaders into a prime minister who now presents deeper European cooperation as a strategic necessity? Does this reflect ideological conversion, geopolitical realism, or a broader restructuring of Danish statecraft?
I think that it's really based on national interests. I think that the current government, and in particular the Danish Prime Minister, has discovered that everything that Danish foreign policy has built on since the Second World War has been NATO and our alliance with the Americans. I think that's also one of the reasons why Denmark has allowed itself to be looking at the EU in this very transactional way. We often accuse Trump of being transactional, but Denmark has also been incredibly transactional in its EU policy. And that's not only the current prime minister, it's been going on since we entered in 73, that our prime ministers and general politicians have been looking at the European Union as merely a market for creating wealth in Denmark by being a market we could sell our products to, and not more. So every time we had a lot of referendums in Denmark on the EU during the years, and it's always been the same in the public debate here. That this is not going to be a federation, this is not going to be a political union, please vote for this treaty, it will never develop into anything, and it's just a market. And it's been the same kind of very skeptical approach to the more like political idea of Europe. So there's not really been much of that. And I think what has happened now is that after the illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and in particular with Donald Trump back in the White House, questioning his support for Ukraine, also who is responsible for the war, and questioning NATO, questioning whether America will even come and help us, Article 5. The Danish Prime Minister has simply made a U-turn and well, pragmatically, turned and asked her closest allies in Denmark and civil servants, what do we do now? What's wise to do? And Europe is there, and it's the only thing left, and that's why I think we see this U-turn. It's not out of love or anything. I think it's very pragmatic, very transactional. The US is no longer there. Geopolitics has fundamentally changed. And now, after 50 years of membership of the EU, we finally see the EU as a more political club than we used to. But it's not come out of idealism, it's come out of need and out of national interest.
Right. The Greenland dispute has elevated questions of sovereignty to the center of Danish politics. In your view, has Donald Trump's revived interest in Greenland merely triggered a short-term rally around the flag effect, or has it fundamentally altered how Danes think about territorial integrity, alliance dependence, and the fragility of the liberal international order?
I think it's true to say that there was this Greenland moment where many of the European leaders, until that happened, the threat to invade Greenland, had sort of tried to accommodate Trump and tried to please him, and I would even say suck up to him. I think we have seen that among many European leaders. But when the threat to invade an ally and take part of the territory of an ally's kingdom, I think that both the Danes, but I think all Europeans have sort of come to realize that we need to stand together and that we need to think about ourselves in different ways, and also the question about territory and integrity and sovereignty, but not sovereignty, I would say, in the narrow sense of protecting only our own territory. We saw clearly that the French, the Germans, even the UK, who is outside the EU, came to our help and rescue in this time. And I also think that the Danes have become much more aware of the importance of saying no to aggressors who threaten territorial integrity. I mean, after all, we have been 4 years in a kind of war. The entire Europe is not only Ukraine with Russia, and there the story, the narrative has been that a country should be able to protect its own borders and decide for itself whether it wants to be a democracy or not. And therefore, I think we were all prepared that when this happened, when Trump and the Americans started threatening an ally, we all of a sudden saw that this could also hurt us. I mean, it's not only Ukraine that can be threatened by an external opponent. It's something that is more general, and it is really a threat to the general international liberal order, the idea of territorial integrity and the respect for countries' right to decide by themselves what kind of society they want to be, and no one should threaten to take other countries' territory by force. I think all of these small different examples have come together with the crisis in Greenland, and it's not been very difficult to convey this kind of similarity to the Ukrainians in this case, because what have they been doing for the past 4 years? They have also insisted on territorial integrity, and that is exactly the same situation we were in when Trump threatened Denmark.
Right. How should we understand Trumpism in this Nordic context? Is Trump best seen as an external disruptor of Danish politics, or as a transnational amplifier of political tendencies that already exist within Europe, such as executive personalization, nationalist rhetoric, distrust of institutions, and the normalization of coercive sovereignty claims?
I think, and I've written about that myself in my Tribalization of Europe book that came out in 2000, that actually, Trump, Brexit, and the destruction of democracy in Hungary and also in Poland earlier were part of the same story, and even the return of Trump 2.0 was inspired a lot by the populism and the extreme right that we have seen rising in Europe since 2010. I think Trump is a symptom of not only populism and the rise of populism, but also a symptom of a new type of autocrats, leaders who manipulate to gain power and to stay in power. So I think also within the academic literature, we've had this discussion where on the one side you had the left-wing analysis of populism saying that it's all about inequality, and then you've had the more the newer types of analysis literature saying that it's actually not the poorest who vote for autocrats. It's more the kind of middle level in society who like to hear these narratives of enemies from outside and draining the swamp, and immigrants will take over our societies. So there is kind of a debate between what are the causes of this, and I think that with Trump and with a lot of the right-wing populists in Europe as well, it's very much a top-down phenomenon where you have designer politics, you have autocrats who want to stay in power and grab power and manipulate and then create the conditions for staying in power by sort of creating these narratives of the elite being the liberals and the wokists and so on. And that is what we see in all the movements in Europe as well. Also Nigel Farage, also AfD in Germany, in Le Pen, and also in the Netherlands previously, but also in many of Central and Eastern European countries, that it's actually more about kleptocracy and the concentration of power than it's about a dissatisfied ordinary citizenry who are rejecting to liberal elites. Because if you look at the statistics, you can see that people have become richer and richer for instance, in Poland, and they still vote for the right wing. And in the US, it was the same. It was not the poorest who voted for Trump. They voted for Hillary in 2016. So I think we have to be aware of not reducing all of what's happening to a kind of a question of inequality. It's also about very, very cynical political leaders who simply create dissatisfaction, and in that way create antagonism and create dissatisfaction by building these narratives of enemies that they can protect against.
Right. Denmark has long been seen as a case where mainstream parties absorb parts of the anti-immigration agenda, thereby containing the electoral breakthrough of the far right. Do you see this as a successful inoculation strategy, or has it instead normalized core elements of far right politics by translating them into state policy?
I think that to a large degree, it's become normalized in the Scandinavian countries. And the reason why it's been so easy to normalize is that we don't have, we are not a constitutional democracy. We are majoritarian democracies where there are very little judicial review, and we don't have a tradition for taking, for minorities taking majority policies to court and to testing it up against a strong constitution. We have a political culture where the majority always decides. And in that type of environment, it's much easier to normalize right-wing policies than in constitutional democracies like the German, for instance, where any minority group could go to the courts and ask, is this in accordance with my rights and the protection of my rights and values. So I think it's been easier in Denmark. It's been going on for many, many years. And the argument that we have been able to eradicate the extreme right is simply not true. Because if you look at the policy by the majority of politicians and political parties, they have simply adopted the right-wing policy, and we have just as many voting for the right-wing political parties today as we had earlier. They are just divided into small different parties. But if you add them up, we still have around between 17% and 20% supporting these kind of parties and also these kind of views. And there's a competition right now in the government or in the Danish campaign of who can be tougher. So I think we have I think it's a misconception in many European countries that we manage to deal with it. I'm not saying that it's not valid to certainly have this discussion. I think it's absolutely valid, and I also think that we need to step up on our liberal values and to say no to all kinds of intolerance to women and also attempts to build on Islamist and extreme Islamist positions. We need to absolutely protect our liberal democracies against that. But I wouldn't say that the taking over of the extreme right is a way to fight the extreme right, because actually we have on average the same support for that kind of views today than we had 20 years ago.
Right. Relatedly, what does the Danish case tell us about the contemporary relationship between mainstream social democracy and populist political logics? Can restrictive migration politics coexist with a democracy center-left project without eroding the normative distinctions between social democracy and the populist radical right?
I don't know if I understood your. Wasn't it a little bit what we already discussed in the previous? Can you maybe make it a bit shorter or more precise? I didn't quite get your question.
Yeah. Can restrictive migration politics coexist with a democratic center-left project without eroding the normative distinctions between social democracy and the populist radical right?
That's a very political question. I think if you ask the Social Democrats, they would absolutely say yes. And even the socialists on the left side of the Danish Social Democratic Party completely support this. So they would say it can coexist. And I think that is exactly a good example of it have become normalized. I think it's completely fair again to raise all the big questions and problems there is with immigration, in particular with immigrants who come with different values. Where I have a problem is when you have no judicial review of those political decisions you take that are sometimes on the edge of what you would call a Rechtsstaat, where you have kind of difficulties in sort of getting a second opinion about the policies you make. I think that is where the problem comes in, not that we have a discussion, an open discussion about the problems that are certainly there. So I think that yes, any social democrat in Denmark would say that this is absolutely compatible. But I think it's a very political question.
Right. Do you think the incoming election demonstrates that external geopolitical crisis can temporarily suspend domestic political accountability? In other words, can international confrontation, whether over Greenland, Ukraine, or transatlantic instability, really legitimate incumbents whose domestic credibility had previously weakened?
I think this is what happens every time there is a crisis. You have political leaders who go in crisis mode and argue that they need power and more competences to deal with the crisis, and therefore other problems are set aside. I think it's a very normal phenomenon. You see it in Hungary as well, where they have had a emergency situation since the COVID period. I think actually it's still there. It's still in action. I'm not quite sure whether it's lifted, but you certainly also see the crisis rhetoric in Denmark. We have a prime minister who's incredibly good at steering crisis and good at crisis management. But the fear is always that you sort of skip more fundamental questions about accountability and democratic accountability and also reasonable restrictions in a situation like that. And you can certainly debate whether we are in that kind of situation. But I actually agree with the Prime Minister that we are in war, and it's not just Ukraine. It's really a very, very dangerous situation Europe is in right now, with being pressured from the east, but also from the west, and not really being able to stand up and take decisions together in Europe. I think it's a disaster, and I think that we need political leaders who can address this kind of questions. So it's always a balance, and it's always something you should reflect about. Has a certain political leader gone too far in this respect? But right now, I think we actually need firm leaders in Europe in order to survive as a continent.
Right. Much of the current debate revolves around whether Frederiksen's firmer line toward Washington has restored public trust. But from a democratic theoretical perspective, how durable is trust that is rebuilt through crisis leadership rather than through institutional responsiveness, social compromise, or policy coherence?
Ooh, that's a big question, which is, I think, can only be answered when we look back in time in a few years. I think that as citizens and voters, we always like to see when our politicians stand up and have, take leadership. And I actually think that a lot of Europeans were very dissatisfied with the first reactions to Donald Trump, where we tried to please him and to sort of just accommodate and turn the other cheek. I think, again, the Greenland moment that everybody talks about is where we finally said no to his demand of taking another ally's territory. And I think that was an important moment that also spiraled into the entire European project of stepping up and saying no. We saw the same in the Middle East, where Europeans have also said it's not our war. We were not consulted about Iran. We cannot just accommodate, even though we are threatened by Trump that he will dissolve NATO and leave NATO and so on. It's over. We have sort of been blinded by our own, I think, inferiority complex in Europe and our dependence on the US. And I think the Greenland crisis all of a sudden made it abundantly clear to most European leaders, and certainly to the Danish Prime Minister, that this is not a sustainable way to move forward with a person that is so unpredictable. We have to say no. And you could see it also had the result that Greenland is now boxed into a working group, and let's not rock the boat. Let's wait and see what happens there. But I think that Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, was the first to actually go down this path and say no to Trump. And since he did that, after humiliating Carney, that he was only a governor, and that the US wanted Canada to be the 51st state, and the rejection of complete rejection to any kind of engagement with this kind of rhetoric, I think that Trump backed down and hasn't raised this question since. So I think that we need leaders at the moment who actually can stand up to tyrants and to tyranny. And tyranny does not only have one face that we see in Russia, it can also be the face we see in the United States at the moment.
Right. You have written extensively on Europe's legal and political development. In light of recent events, do you think Denmark is now moving from traditional status as a semi-detached, opt-out oriented member state towards something closer to the European core? Or is this shift still contingent, fragile, and driven more by fear than by conviction?
I think, as I said in the introduction to this interview, where I think you sort of asked the same, that at least initially the turn to Europe has been very transactional and very pragmatic, and simply a question about, all right, we lost our ally, now we need to find new friends, and therefore we turn to Europe. But I actually believe that this could develop into a closer attachment in general to the European project. I think, in fact, that what we are seeing right now could be a more fundamental shift where also Danish politicians have started suggesting that we could go from unanimity to majority voting, qualified majority voting in foreign policy, that we could build up a European army, that we could even federalize, take up depth in common, and give the EU a bigger budget, also to create better conditions for business and innovation and tech companies in Europe. All that kind of things remove barriers in the internal market that have grown and to a crazy level, as illustrated in the Draghi report and the Enrico Letta report as well. That would take more Europe. And I think the Danes are gradually, and the Danish politicians are gradually realizing that if Europe has to survive in a new global context with adversaries all around us, and where we strategically have to become, not too dependent on any big power, and we need to de-risk, as von der Leyen has also said several times, then Europe simply has to be stronger and more independent, and also more of a power that projects its power towards outside actors, not only a defense, a union that defends itself and maybe builds capabilities, military capabilities, either within NATO, the European pillar in NATO, but also in the European Union, but also projects power. And I think that the Danish top politicians are gradually moving in that direction. I could anticipate it. I think we have seen signs, but again, I would say that there has not really been much debate about that in the Danish public during this campaign. It's sort of still the sense, I think, among many political leaders that it's a little bit dangerous to start talking about this. But let's see in the coming years whether we are not, in fact, moving closer to Europe and to the core. Also by getting rid of our remaining opt-outs. We do have opt-outs still in Denmark in Justice and Home Affairs and against the euro. So we are not part of the euro area, even though our currency is pegged to the euro. So if that would be the next step to get rid of that and to really join the European core and the power center, I think that would be the next step if this was to materialize.
Right. How do you assess the relationship between today's European far right and Trumpism? Should we think of them as part of a coherent transnational ideological family, or are they better understood as overlapping but ultimately fragmented projects, united by anti-liberal impulses, yet divided by national interests, geopolitical alignments, and competing visions of sovereignty?
My analysis is that something much, much bigger is at stake here. We are dealing with a funny, strange combination of populist leaders who are kleptocrats and, as I said earlier, who are designing populism from above, creating kind of tensions and antagonism in the people they are leading. And I think that's very, very dangerous. It's a very different way of looking at populism than previously. What we have seen in particular in the United States, and I think also increasingly in Europe, is that a lot of the people from Silicon Valley, Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance, who was invented by Peter Thiel, Musk and Bezos and many of the other tech oligarchs, they are the ones who want to destroy Europe. We also saw in the American foreign policy strategy, security strategy that was just published before Christmas, that the Americans now want to support regime change in Europe and want to dissolve the European Union. And it could easily, if you were very didn't read between the lines or didn't go deeper into this analysis, you could say, okay, they are just supporting Orban and other right-wing groups, AFD, where Musk has also been very clearly involved in supporting them. But if you dig just a little bit deeper than this, what you find out that, again, it's about money. It's about control of the tech giants who want access to an unregulated European market. And that is exactly what's happening. So what's happening in Europe, and the reason why the American administration is such a strong supporter of the extreme right in Europe, is in reality that the tech giants in the US want access to a very rich European market, and they do not like the European Union to regulate anything. They are against any kind of European regulation of the tech giants, and that's why they are supporting the extreme right. And they talk about us excluding and being very, very critical of the extreme right. They talk about that as censorship. But in reality, we have to be aware that the US has dropped to place number 57 in the Freedom of Press Index, they are the ones who have a problem with censorship. It's not the European Union. But I really think that this analysis goes very nicely with what I said previously, that increasingly the new time of populism we see and autocratic leadership is by design from the top, and the tech bros play a very big role here. The reason why they want to get rid of the European Union, to get extreme far-right parties in power, is because they hope that these extreme right parties and political leaders will say no to Europe, will take power back to the nation states, and will dissolve the entire European project so that they can earn money, divide and rule in Europe, and get access to very wealthy citizens who can buy their products and where they can manipulate children and everyone else with their algorithms without any hindrances. That is what it's really about. And I know it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but there's lots of research behind this. And the more I dig into this, the more I read about the link between extreme right populists and the tech industry in the US, the more scary I get.
And finally, Professor Wind, looking beyond the election itself, what do you see as the most important long-term question for Denmark and Europe? How to defend national sovereignty without collapsing into nationalism? How to deepen European cooperation without reproducing democratic alienation? Or how to confront far-right normalization without simply borrowing its political vocabulary?
How to strengthen the European Union in the current situation. It's very difficult because, as you know, it was built as a market which, 27, 28, of course, developed over the years to become a larger and larger union. We want more members. We want Ukraine into the union. We have a lot of kind of institutional problems in terms of how we can ramp up the decision-making processes. Some member states, because they have governments that are very concerned with their sovereignty, including Denmark, we have also been very much against any further power to the European Union. And you have several countries with nationalist leaders, Czech Republic, Slovaks, Hungary, a president in Poland. So we have a lot of disagreement about how to strengthen the European Union, and that's what really makes me kind of maybe not so optimistic in the short run, because we have a system right now in the European Union where we need unanimity when we want to integrate further. We also need unanimity when we want new members. We need unanimity, as you can see, with the loan to Ukraine that Orban is blocking because he's afraid of losing the election on the 12th of April. So there are some inbuilt weaknesses that are very strong in the European project. We also have an upcoming election in France, where we can have yet another extreme right party going into the Élysée Palace. So we are facing some very, very big institutional problems, and I'm almost, tempted to say that it can make or break, that either we really, really feel the pressure from the global stage of coming not just from the US and Russia, but also China, and get our act together and move from unanimity to qualified majority voting quickly, or maybe create a new club for those who are willing. I think we already see signs of that. In relation to Ukraine, we have this alliance of the willing, and I think that could be an alternative to the European Union. We even talk about having Canada join at some point some of the structures in Europe. So either we get our act together, the liberal democracies that are still left in the world, and ramp up our cooperation, or the whole thing explodes. And if the current political leaders are not able to see the dangers of not, preserving our way of life in Europe, also for our children and grandchildren, protecting democracies and free speech, and being able to defend ourselves quite basically and survive in a very competitive market, perhaps by also a more aggressive industrial policy, then I'm afraid that the whole European project could actually fall apart. I know the Americans are working on that. They hope this will happen. Trump loves to deal with individual leaders and not with the EU as a bloc. But we also have to remember that we are a very powerful bloc. We are almost 500 million Europeans. We are a wealthy continent. We have the longest life expectancy. We have free education, free welfare, free access to education, and so on. So we have all the opportunities to become a strong, united power on the global stage. But we need political leaders right now who can see this and also see the necessity of this, and who will act on this. And that's also why I'm actually, despite all the criticism you can come up with political leaders, against political leaders in this time where they actually do take leadership, I think that is what we need right now, because the alternative is much, much worse.
Professor Marlene Wind, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.